Good evening, everybody. How are you doing? And you're very welcome to this evening's Junior Cycle Geography webinar, in which we'll be reviewing the sample Junior Cycle SEC exam paper, and that's presented by our Real World Geography author, Peter Lydon. I hope the weather is not as bad for you as it is where I'm living, but I do appreciate, thanks very much everyone who's joining us this evening. I know it's a very busy time of the year for teachers, so to give us 45 minutes of your time this evening is much appreciated, but I hope and I'm sure that you will glean a lot from this, and Peter will have lots of interesting things to say about the exam and a new publication. By way of introduction, my name is Conor Walker. I'm the head of post-primary publishing at Folens, and I would have worked very closely with Peter and his co-author Tara Fitzharris on the publication of our second edition of Real World Geography, which is, I suppose, given the fact that it's a little bit of a time since the specification was implemented, we've had an opportunity to speak with teachers about how they found it and what they think of our own book. And given the, I suppose, the release of the SEC sample paper and plans for CBAs and so on, we were able to revise the edition to cater for all those aspects of the course. So we're very excited about it, and it looks great, even if I do say so myself. If you would like to learn a little bit more about real world geography, please feel free to visit Folens.ie, where you can check out ebooks of the textbook, the skills book, and the teacher's guide, along with all the digital resources that we have on offer with the teaching package. Bit of housekeeping as well, in case I forget to mention it. There is a questions box. We'll be having a Q&A at the end of Peter's presentation. If you have a question that you'd like to put to him or to me, please just click the question button there. I think that's at the bottom of your screen, and post your question. And if we have time, we'll get around to that at the end of the session. Also, if you wouldn't mind hanging on right until the end of the presentation, there's a very short single question survey that we have, which we'd like you to answer. And again, we'd really appreciate it if you could answer that for us. Okay, so I think most people on this call will know Peter. He's pretty much your go-to person in all things geography. He teaches at Wesley College. He's been there for a number of years now, and is also president of the AGTI, which represents geography and geography teachers nationwide. Peter also has extensive experience in training both at junior cycle and leaving cert level, and previously has worked with the PDST, delivering in service both at junior and senior cycle levels. So I think that's enough from me. I'm going to hand you over to Peter now, and then we'll come back at the end for a Q&A and just to wrap things up in general. So Peter, I'm just going to...
Okay, so thanks, Conor.
Yeah, no worries. I'm just going to hand you control now.
Perfect. Yep, there you go. I think you can probably see that okay. Perfect. Well, we'll jump in. Yeah, thanks everybody for turning up. It's always great to see such a fantastic turnout, and I really hope this is worth your while. I've been gathering insights over the last while into the sample examination paper, and so it's nice to kind of put those into effect. Okay, look, just as an aside, if you ever want to get in touch with me about anything, if you have a question or a query or anything, you're stuck on something, feel free to you can drop me something on Twitter there, Peter_Lydon, or you know, I'm on Facebook as well, so feel free to drop me a line if you need anything answered. I suppose one of the really the best places to start off, I know we're looking at the examination paper, but I think this is really crucial, and I don't think it's something that can be overplayed. You'll recognize that as the structure of the specification. So we have three strands, we have these three elements, we have the three I's from geoliteracy, and then we have our learning outcomes. We'll come to that in a moment. But probably the most important thing to know about specification is that if it's in the specification, it's examinable, and that includes the language. Okay, so the language in the elements section, the language, you know, the three I's, the language in each of the learning outcomes. Students kind of need to know that. Now, you wouldn't jump in with first year with that, but certainly by third year, students should know words like implication and interactions and sustainability and so on, right? So I just wanted to open with that because it really is important. So we have the 28 learning outcomes, and one of the things I've done in the second edition is actually just to simplify and take away some of the things that at this stage are now just really distractions, because I think everybody's familiar with the learning outcomes. Certainly teachers are familiar with the learning outcomes. So we don't need to paste those all over the things that the students have to sort of experience when they're learning. They'll know what they are through you teaching them to them. But we put the list in there in the second edition along with the relevant chapters, so you can see exactly which chapters address those learning outcomes. And actually, just on that, because it's really, really important, this learning outcome 1.10 is a sort of special sort of standalone learning outcome. And so in both the first edition and the second edition, we've kept a separate chapter for that, because that's really important that students get to, like, that specific learning outcome talks about investigating a chosen landscape. So you have to have a very particular landscape for that learning outcome. And we've done Dingle. And actually what I've done with the second edition is to actually give lots of pointers to CBA2 in that chapter. So I actually just wanted to squeeze that in there. It's kind of really important, okay? You know, you might have some questions about that. And so what I did then, myself and Tara, is we took the learning outcomes and we said, look, what's the best way to divide this up so that teachers, this would speak to teachers that were familiar with it. So we simplified it. We've got physical geography, economic geography, settlement, population, economic development, atmosphere, weather and climate. That's your core junior cycle geography. And so it makes sense to organize it along those lines, and that's what we've done. So the contents page is divided like that, and you can see each of the sections in there. So anytime you need to find a very particular topic, it's literally go to the contents page, bang, there it is, okay? And of course, we've separate sections on maps and photographs, which actually we've put together, like we've consolidated that into individual chapters, okay? Might be more on that later. This is the distribution of questions from the sample examination paper. And do you know what, I'm going to make this available somewhere. Like, if you send me a message, I'll send this on to you as a Word document. And it would be useful each year just to kind of keep a track of where the questions are being asked. And you can see quite clearly there's a number of sections in the specification where they didn't ask a particular question at all, right? Obviously, there's plenty on maps and photographs in there. There's a few here on processes of erosion, transportation, deposition, as you'd expect, okay? A fairly good spread of questions, but very clearly some areas that weren't asked. And what you would expect, possibly in the actual exam in June this year, that maybe one or two of these bits that have been left out, that they would be examined in that exam. So we're going to have a look at this. So what I did was I looked at the paper just to see what styles of questions were in there. And I kind of split it up into sort of three different styles. There were questions that required sort of one-word answers or one-sentence answers. And they're typically, you know, it's all the stuff that the keyword connections kind of address. You know, it's keywords, it's key definitions, it's, you know, straightforward knowledge questions, okay? There's one or two that you could sort of roughly say are grid references, but they come under the skills-based questions. So there are short skills-based questions that ask for things like grid references. But there's also longer skills-based questions. So like, I'll show you one from aerial photographs that was in there later on. And there's things like graphs where you have to complete a graph. And then the third type are paragraph style questions. And these are really important because what's kind of interesting with this new common level exam is that you'd expect pretty much all students to cope quite well with the sort of one-word answer questions. I think where the differentiation will occur for what we used to call higher level, students who took a higher level paper, I think the differentiation is going to be in the paragraph style questions, okay? And, it's the whole thing there about, how manageable the paper will be for a very broad range of ability. But anyway, the paragraph style questions are going to be really, really important, okay? And one of the things that you'll note about it is, and I'll show you samples of these, is that even though we've got a lot more skills-based questions, underpinning those skills-based questions is knowledge. And so it's really important that students have a good foundational knowledge from which they can actually answer skills-based questions, right? Look, there's a bunch of other questions. I won't dwell on this too long. There's obviously these 3 separate styles in the sample exam paper, but there's lots of other ones that they could ask, right? And that's a page from the skills book in the 2nd edition that you'd be able to look at that at your own time, okay? So look, here's a question that appeared in the sample examination paper, and actually I think it's quite a nice question. They give you a stimulus with a couple of questions. These are the ones with the white boxes where they ask you about physical features, and it's just a case of arranging those. And I think they're probably going to be maybe 2. I think there'll be 2 marks each. 3 might be too much, but I think there'll be maybe 2 marks each. 1 might make it a little bit too hard because for some students, they're going to need, like in the old ordinary level paper, naming things was sometimes 2 marks, but sometimes 3. So now giving them 3 marks makes the marks clock up for students who are less academic, right? So they could be 2, maybe even possibly 3, but certainly at least 2, I think. And then you've got this paragraph style question, okay? And it's straightforward enough. Imagine you're a settler, you've arrived here. Where would you locate, right? A, B, or C? And so I've done this with my students in class, and a couple of them picked A and a couple picked B, but actually C is the better answer. Now that's after having taught this in class, right? And it wasn't that the guys who had A and B, they had some good answers, but they weren't the best answers, right? They didn't include as many possible factors. So look, I took this and I thought that's a nice way to actually present that content in the book, right? So what I've done with it is I sort of created this sort of exam expert kind of a panel, where you've actually got this question, right? So which would you choose, A, B, or C, right? And so this question is really about factors affecting the location of early settlement. Now, one of the things they weren't able to show on the graphic is a kind of a slight upland area, similar to what you might find at Mount Sandal. But you'll see that I've highlighted sort of 4 possible answers that students could give to this. Now, I think in the space here, it doesn't really tell us how much detail you have to go into, but I think that for that amount of space, they'd want to have 3 reasons, okay? And so they could go, well, look, you need access to water. Why? Well, for food, water for food, cooking, for drinking, and of course rivers provide fish, right? They would need access to a forest. Why? Because they provide nuts and berries as well as their homes to wild animals, okay? And so on. So I've highlighted 4 there, but they could pick 3, and I think that would be plenty. Ideally, you'd like to see the question say, explain 2 reasons or explain three reasons. So I'm hoping the real exam in the summertime will do that. But if not, you kind of want students to kind of figure that they could get 3 solid reasons into that space, okay? Obviously, that might be a challenge for some students, but 2 would be good as well. This question was a really interesting question, and I know at the time this came out, there was a bit of a reaction to it. So you've got this straightforward sort of approach, like where you're asked at point A, point B, at which site on the map would freeze-thaw action most likely to occur? So obviously upland area, point A, tick the box. I think that that's probably a little bit more than 2 marks, because you have to be able to read and interpret the map and then make the connection to freeze-thaw action. So there's 2 cognitive exercises in there, and so I think that's worth a bit more than maybe 2 marks, maybe 4, right? But then point 2 says state 1 reason why that's likely to occur. So you give it basically a definition of that. Freeze-thaw action is a weathering process that occurs in upland areas where temperatures fall below 0 degrees, right? So that would be, and that would have to be 4 marks, okay, because it's a statement rather than a name. So it would have to be, I think, 4 marks for that. And then state 2 processes of glacial erosion listed in the box below. And funny enough, this is easier than it looks on paper. It's easier than it looks, but it would be difficult for some students, because I find students get a bit caught out by the shun words, you know, action and saltation and abrasion and so on. But because the answers are here, they've been kind of hinted at, right? And so I'm inclined to think that these are going to be maybe 2 marks each. I think 3 might be too much. But I think 2 marks each, right? And so this was a question here. Part C was a bit that kind of had people talking, because it's, you know, you're hiking through this landscape with a friend, and your friend who's really into geography goes, could you explain how the processes of erosion, of either river erosion or I think it's glacial erosions in there as well, shape this landscape, okay? And really what this question is describe and explain the formation of one feature of river erosion, or describe and explain the formation of one landform of river erosion, okay? So, but the emphasis on process, so they have to name the process and then give the explanation. I think this is likely to be 10 marks, but I think a good approach to dealing with this is actually to use this kind of little, kind of sort of pro forma kind of structure to an answer. So you can say to students, you need to feed the answer, right? So name the feature, right? So in this case, you have to actually pick it out, because the question says rivers, or it says glacial or rivers. So they need to actually say, right, I'm going to write about cirques, right? So they'll go, a cirque is an armchair shaped hollow containing a lake, right? And so they've named the feature, right? Maybe given a definition, and then they would explain it. So they give the explanation, and then they would give an example at the bottom here, right? And then they would draw a diagram. So that kind of feed acronym is a kind of a nice way to think, particularly about the physical landscape features, whether it's rivers, coasts, glaciers, and even some of the weathering ones. So they have the feature, they have the explanation, and they have the example. And so, you know, the bit about, I'd be inclined to think that, you know, you don't want them kind of saying, well, my good friend Johnny, here is a cirque. They can just go straight forward into a grid reference, 00, I'm going to go 001, 643. There is a Corrie, or Corrie Lake, even they could mention that and then put it in the context of the overall Corrie, right? And then off they go and explain how it was formed. And you can see here that the plucking and the abrasion, so all the key words are in bold. And so they're kind of like, that's kind of like the target language. And actually it's really important, just as an aside, I've had students in the past who've written beautiful work. It's kind of like you make a cup of tea and sit down and read the answer. It's so good. But if they're not hitting the key words, they're not going to accumulate the marks. So it's really important that they hit that target language. So here's a sort of another example that you'd be familiar with. This was like, draw the diagram of a volcano and label these. And I think this will probably be, you know, it could be 2 + 1 actually for this. So 2 for showing and 1 for naming, and then maybe 2 marks for overall quality. So that could be, potentially that could be like a 17 marker question. Like it's hard really to say how that would go, but typically show and name would be 2 + 1, right? Could be 3 + 1 as well, just to make it easy for students. But I find all students tend to do quite well on this. Name an example of rock that forms when molten rock cools. So that could be like basalt. And then state whether the following statements are true or false. So I think true or false questions would be like 2 markers, more than likely. But here's one of these kind of questions again. So instead of writing about negative impacts of volcanoes, they ask you to imagine you're a journalist. So it just in case, there should be some line that goes, you know, I'm reporting from such and such a volcanic eruption, and they should name it. Okay, so you know, we have this case study of the Eyjafjallajökull, I can't pronounce it, volcano in Iceland, but it would need to give the name of the volcano and mention the date it occurred. Okay, so it needs to be you know, correct, and then give the negative impacts, because it is only about the negative impacts. So that could be economic, or it could be social, or it could be environmental as well. But even though this is not headed up as an exam type thing, that's basically an exam sample answer there, right? This is the settlement question. I mentioned this earlier, just kind of skills-based question, because it's kind of nice. I haven't put in the large-scale map, but that's kind of a new feature this year that kind of threw people a little bit. So we do need to be prepared for the 1 to 10,000. It's in the second edition, so it's totally covered. But you should also anticipate the possibility of other scales, maybe even like the climate map. There's a climate map in the sample paper, which is a map at a different scale, so that kind of thing. So we've kind of replicated those questions, and there's going to be a solution to this in the teacher's guide that you'll be able to access. But this one's basically, location A is now a housing estate. Why is it a good location for a housing estate? And so it's fairly straightforward answers for that. Okay, so we do have this. We've put all the aerial photograph stuff into a single chapter, just consolidated that so it's easier for teachers. And so we're just acting on the feedback that teachers gave us. Obviously, in, say, for example, the rivers, coasts and glaciers chapters, we have, there's the aerial photograph skills are there as well, because you have to have them there. But we consolidated that, and we did the same thing with the maps section. We consolidated the maps chapter. So rather, because I think teachers were finding it kind of difficult having it spread across different topics. So all the key skills are given in these sort of learning goals that are in the opener for the chapter on maps. And so we've put them all together. So it should be fairly simple and straightforward to just follow from point A to point B. And then there's things like sample answers to certain questions. So this is sort of an exam expert sample answer on the location of Carlow and how Carlow grew over time. Now, obviously, that's, no student will write all of that. This is about giving you and giving students choice. 3 of those points will be absolutely plenty as a reason for why Carlow developed where it did. But you could pick any 3, and so weaker students could pick the 3 shorter ones, but stronger students could pick the 3 longer ones, so that would be straightforward. So this is a kind of an interesting question. I thought I might just sort of take a look at this, because just to give you an idea about where I think this might go. So I'm actually going to grab a pen here. I'm using a mouse, so it may not be ideal, but which of the following coastal processes had most impact on shaping the landscape? So was it deposition or erosion? Okay, so it's going to be erosion. We don't have any beaches here. Okay, and I think potentially, there's a bit of me that thinks that this could be 2 marks, but again, there's 2 processes going on. One is interpreting the map, like reading the map and going, okay, well, what do I think's going on here? And the second thing is actually connecting that to the coastal processes. So that could be like a 2 or a 4 marker, right? Again, considering that it's a common level paper, and in theory, all students should be able to have a good go at it, right? So potentially 2 or 4 in there. But just to kind of contrast that, the second question here is, what type of road is OR559? And without the map there, we would know straight away that was a regional road. So the OR is kind of a hint, and I think that would just be a 2 marker potentially. And I know there'd be a bit of debate about that. We're in the dark until there's a marking scheme, but I think 2 would be fine there. But this question's interesting, and I think this is really important, particularly if you're fairly new to exams generally. If you're NQT perhaps, and you're not familiar with the way the exams are written. This is an interesting question because it has named 2 different pieces of evidence from the map extract above that show how this area has developed to support tourism, and state how each of these can be used by tourists. Now, that's 2 separate questions, and typically in good question construction, you would separate that into 2 questions, okay? Now, they do kind of facilitate the answer by actually labeling it here in the box, okay? But actually, it would be nice to see that listed as 2 separate questions. But here's the thing, they're looking for 2 pieces of evidence, right? And to my mind, that evidence has to be 2 things, right? The first one is you have to name one. So I'm just going to put initial in here. I'm going to put, say, the Dingle Way, right? I'm just going to put that in there. But the second thing that you might do, and I think again, just to differentiate across the range of students is to give a grid reference, right? Now, on this extract, they didn't put in the grid letter, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it is for Dingle. But you could give a grid reference at, say, what's that? 325971. Okay, so you'd write 325971, and then there's no doubt that the student has given the evidence. They've named the feature, so the Dingle Way, and they've given the grid reference for it. And then, of course, they just need to put in a sentence about how can it be used by tourists, right? So this is a way-marked walk, and they would say the Dingle Way is a way-marked walk. Tourists can walk along this route, and they can enjoy the lovely scenery of Sleigh Head and the Dingle Peninsula, right? So just by way of example, right? And then the second one could be something like, say, the viewpoint site here. So they could go viewpoint site. I'm just going to put VP for viewpoint, and then give the grid reference for that, which in this case is 316975. Okay, so they could give the grid reference and then say, well, tourists could drive up to the parking place and walk up to the viewpoint site and look out across the Atlantic and admire the waves and so on. So something along those lines, okay? And then B here, which is kind of, oh, sorry, in terms of marks then, I think you're looking at maybe 4 marks here, right? 2 plus 2. So 2 for maybe naming and 2 for the grid reference, okay? And then maybe another, say, 4 marks for this, right? And that's probably going to be divided into 2 marks for statement and 2 marks for development. So that 2 marks for development will be 1 plus 1. So it could be something like, the Dingle Way is a way-marked walk. These are 2 marks, okay? And then 2 things. Tourists could walk along this route, and they could enjoy the scenery of the Dingle Peninsula. So something along those lines, right? Now, again, that's pure guesswork, right? No real idea until it comes out. But I think that's enough marks that would allow the range of students to have a good go at the paper. This one here was quite interesting. Okay, so this was the coastal defence question. An example, you have to kind of write to a councillor and name an example of a coastal defence measure that would protect its coastline from future erosion, and then you have to say how it would work. So there's 2 things in here, right? Those 2 things are name the coastal defence measure and then say how it would work. And it also says to you, if you want to draw a diagram, you can do that. And of course, students should draw a diagram because it's a handy mark. If it says you may draw a diagram, the marking scheme would have to allow marks for a diagram, okay? So just to show you what we've done with that kind of thing, this is sort of an exam expert panel from the coast chapter, right? Human interaction with coast. So this hits LO 2.8. And I've put a couple of questions here, but of course, these are the different ways that you could protect the coastline. So they could pick one of those. I always forget how to pronounce this. Is it gabions or gabions? So gabions, I think, is the typical, but I've heard different pronunciations for this. So a student could say, well, this is these are stones that have been put into a wire cage, and they form a wall that help absorb the impact of erosion. Okay, so they've it's a fairly simple, fairly straightforward solution, right? And so they could put that in a letter to their councillor. Dear councillor, I think that you should put gabions along the coastline and explain what they are, and these absorb the energy of waves. Okay, just a little quick assessment for learning activity there if you want to do in the classroom with them as well, where you want to sort of buzz quiz students, name 4 ways, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 3 impacts, just list them. So kind of nice little quick quiz thing there. And actually, just a little thing here, we've kind of replicated that in the skills book where I've taken that question, describe how people, oops, sorry, that's kind of a bit wonky. Describe how people have interacted with and managed coasts. So examine the satellite photograph below. So I just put in Strand Hill, and then there's similar questions there that you can answer on that. So it's nice for students to kind of practice that style of question. Just last bit here on CBAs, we put in these sort of, I know classroom-based assessments are a thing that teachers are asking lots of questions about. So we put in these sort of warm-ups. They're kind of ways of getting students used to the idea of doing CBAs. the most important part of the CBA, or the two most important parts, are the news story in CBA 1. In CBA 2, it's going to be the local area, but it's the news story in CBA 1, and then the 5 WH questions, right? They're really the key things. So there's a bunch of these in the second edition, and these are actually, they're real life news stories. They're not makey uppy news stories, they're real life news stories. You can go and look up Terra del Fuego, right? Or not Terra del Fuego, Volcan del Fuego in Guatemala, and you'll see this. And there's a bunch of questions at the end, and you'll see that these are all the 5 WH questions, right? And all students need to do is get the answers to those questions and then complete the rest of the fill in the details under the different descriptors. So there's a whole bunch of those, and then we have warm-ups for CBA 2 as well. And I think students will actually ease them very gently into the idea of a CBA. So I know that's very quick, but just a quick run through of some of the style of questions that I think are going to come up. Connor, I'm going to hand back to you now, if that's okay. I know you have a couple of things you want to.
Yeah, I'll just show my screen now. Can you see mine now?
Yeah, I can see that there, yeah.
Okay, great. Listen, thanks so much for that really comprehensive view of, I guess, an insider, your thoughts on the exam and the different exam questions being asked. And I suppose you've had a chance to as well show how we've addressed some of those areas in the new edition. So again, if you've liked what Peter's shown, and particularly the screenshots and the samples from the books, please feel free to go onto Folens.ie to take a look at the ebooks and the digital resources that we have available. Also, just in relation to contacting your rep, if you would like to get in touch with them about the second edition, please give them a shout. They're available for calls or appointments at any time that suits you, and we offer support for book rental schools as well, so feel free to ask them any questions that you have in relation to that. And then also very soon we'll be sending out direct sample mail outs to schools in the next week or two. So if you'd like to just ask any more questions about that and their availability, please contact your rep. And you can do that by just simply Googling Folens rep, and that should take you to the web page that allows you to input your roll number, and then your rep and the relevant contact details can display for you. Okay, so I think the next bit is just a Q&A. We've got about 10 minutes, Peter, and there's a fair amount of questions that we have to get through here.
Okay. Yeah.
What I might do is, I don't know, maybe just start with some of the stuff specific to what you were presenting on in relation to just the exam and exam content and expectations. So one question we have here is, do you know if marks will be shown for individual questions in the exam paper? In mock exam, students weren't given this information.
Yeah, they weren't in the science paper in 2019 either. They just had the headline marks at the top of each question. So at the moment, I haven't heard anything back. We did raise that with the SEC. We had an online session about a year ago, and we sent in some feedback. They won't comment because of the integrity of the exam. I'd really like to see that, because otherwise it becomes a sort of partly a paper management exercise for students. But at the moment, I think the best we can kind of hope for is what they did with science in their first exam, where you have the headline marks, like 35 marks for question 1, 40 marks for question 2, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So.
And then another one just in relation to, I guess it's to the paper as well. I guess it's the question in relation to glacial processes and erosion, I think. Yeah. Would you need to explain the processes, for example, plucking and abrasion, or is naming enough?
That's a really, really good question. What I can tell you is that the intention originally was that students should be able to explain the processes. That was the intention. And I think I actually posted this as an update on the AGTI website back in 2017, 2018, when the specification was being written, because that was quite an important thing. And I know teachers had a lot of questions about that. There will be marks for naming the process. And I think what will happen is that if you name the process, you'll get a mark. But if you explain the process, they'll be free, the examiner will have freedom to give a mark for that. So it'll be about, because there has to be a standardization, better answers are going to accumulate more marks. I know that that's not a very solid black and white answer for you, because there is a sort of a gray area there about how much detail would you have to put. But I think clearly if you have two answers and one of them, you know, within the same time frame, and one of them explains the features of erosion, you'd have to say that that's the better answer, and or the landform or the process of erosion, that's the better answer. And so it would be standardized up, if that makes any sense.
Okay. Okay, next question, in relation to OS maps and incorporating it, I suppose, into your teaching. Just Peter, just wondering, as there are so many questions which link to OS maps, would you recommend spending time doing the basic map skills first before going into, say, the rivers, sea, and glaciation chapters?
Oh yeah, look, absolutely. You have to cover those basic skills first. Yeah, I know that's kind of, I know in some of the in-services you could have this impression that you could just jump in with maps. You can't assume that kids will pick up grid references like that. So absolutely, yeah, no, cover the basics first, and that applies to everything. You know, like I mentioned, learning outcome 1.10, which is kind of more in line with the kind of units of learning that the JCT originally had in mind. But you couldn't go into class and just jump in and teach those. You need the foundational concepts. So always start with the basics and build on that, build up. Absolutely, yeah, no, 100%. Start with the basics, yeah.
Okay. This is just a question from a teacher, I guess, who's had some experience of the mock marking scheme. I guess fundamentally, I think what they're asking is, in your opinion, do students need to write more concisely for junior cycle geography?
It's a really good question. What I've said to my students, and it's kind of a rough guide, I'm not sure if they're going to use the old statement and development approach to marking, where you got 2 marks for a statement, say, and 1 mark for development. But what I've always said to my student is, write for every key idea, basically, you would write 1 sentence, only have 1 idea in each sentence, and that's 1 mark. So think of it in those terms. And if they follow that rule, they would be writing enough. So for example, they might say something like, the water flows from the hard rock onto the soft rock. The soft rock is eroded more quickly, right? So 1 mark, say there. This creates a nick point. A nick point is a dip in the water, or a dip in the river channel. That would be 1 mark. So it's literally 1 idea for 1 mark. It is really hard to know until we see a marking scheme. But I think if you follow that kind of idea of, it's almost like, now take this with a pinch of salt, but it's almost like key idea definition 1 mark, right? Or keyword definition 1 mark, keyword definition 1 mark. Or if you name a process and you describe that process, harken back to the previous question, 1 mark. So I think if you gear your students that way, it actually is kind of easier for them. And it's a good way of actually getting them to think about not writing long sentences with lots of ands in it, that they think of, it's step by step by step by step, and it's 1 mark, 1 mark, 1 mark, 1 mark. I think that answers that, I think. Other than that, it's kind of hard really to know how much detail exactly until we see the marking scheme.
Thanks for that. Okay. This is, there's a lot in this question, but probably covers a lot of different things and a lot of things to unpack. So during the in-services, there was a lot of talk about unpack. Okay. Just about, I suppose it's a question about being confused about the language and not sure how to unpack the learning outcomes for every topic. And also a question relating to that about case studies. Do you need them? Is it true that they're needed, or are they kind of jettisoned? Are they requirements still?
Oh no, you absolutely need case studies. And actually, I'm glad you. Can you hand back to me for a minute, because I put some other stuff together and I thought it might be just too much, but if you could hand back to me, I can show you.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, you'll be able to see that. Let me just. I have stuff. Just yeah, look, okay, unpacking, right. So here's right. So the JCT and the NCCA talk about unpacking the learning outcomes. And so if I flick all the way back to the learning outcomes, just to show you very quickly, here they are. They're all kind of vague statements, right? So the big question on teachers' minds is, how do you know what to teach for those, right? So what we did was we've unpacked those for you, right? So what I did was I took the learning outcomes and I broke them up into learning goals, right? So I think this is volcanoes, yeah. So you can see like 2.1, 2.2, and so on. So 2.1 is describe and explain how volcanoes are formed, which is basically a question, right? So at the end of this chapter, you'll be able to describe and explain how volcanoes are formed. And what I did is I linked that to each section in the book, right? So how volcanoes are formed, right? And then that's kind of linked to the rapid revision section at the end of each chapter. And actually that's kind of really useful because it's not like just keywords all over again. It's actually really short, succinct. If you have a student who's weak and who's struggling, that's actually not a bad place for them to start, actually. Do you know that? And then go back, right? And then there's a link between that rapid revision then and to 2.1 in the skills book, right? So there's kind of a thread running all the way through the teacher's book all the way to the skills book, and that unpacks the learning outcome. So really all that's about is take the content of the learning outcome, even though they didn't give us the content, but take the content and unpack it so that the students know what they have to learn. We've done that for you, like it's there, and it's you can bet all the boxes are ticked on that, right? In terms of case studies, I did have a sample of a case study here, so I'm glad you've asked that. You absolutely do need case studies. The difference between this specification and the old junior cert was that in the old junior cert, they listed the case studies that you must do. So everybody had to do Mount St. Helens. Now it's wide open, but they do. So this is actually one of the questions off the sample paper where students have to explain a weather event that they studied and how it was formed. Like the whole question is about a significant weather event. And so I've got this case study on Hurricane Ophelia in there, and literally that exam expert is the answer to question 7E really, and more besides. I mean, you could whittle it down. That's just one. You absolutely need case studies. The difference with this specification compared to the old one is it's up to you to choose the case studies that you do. But we've got you covered in the second edition for that easily, so you wouldn't have anything to worry about there.
Thanks for that, Peter. I know we're kind of just pushing beyond the 45 minutes, but
yeah, sure.
You want to just maybe scroll to the thank you slide. I think you have that in your deck. And just to remind or ask people if they wouldn't mind just before they leave us to answer the single question survey that we have, that would be great.
I'll hand back to you there, Connor, if you like.
Oh, great, yeah. Have I got it?
There you go.
Okay. So yeah, there we go. So Peter, thanks so much for that. I think that was really informative. I think for anyone who's has questions about the sample paper and what maybe to expect and how to plan and prepare for it, I think that I'm sure and I hope that people will have found that useful. I guess just there was one question I spotted here where someone was just asking about, is there a reasoning maybe behind not giving students choice on the paper? Because there isn't, I believe, in it. They just have to answer all.
No, God. Yeah, look, everything of course is going to come down to the marking scheme. We did sort of feed back to the SEC that and I say we, I mean the Association of Geography Teachers, that it's almost like, because students have to do all 10 questions, it's almost like how well you do could be based partly on how quickly you can complete the paper. But what I found testing this with my students is that the weaker students flew through the questions but didn't write lots of detail, but finished the paper but didn't finish it terribly well. The stronger students didn't finish the paper because they spent too long on some of the answers. And then the students who were kind of in the middle, you know, they did okay. They did very well. Like they were kind of higher merit, you know, but they didn't write enough detail really, in order to clock up all the possible marks that I had assigned to the scheme that I used. So it does look like there's going to be a trade-off between how much detail students write and whether they finish the paper, and that's kind of unfortunate because it should be a manageable paper that tests students' geography, but I think it's going to be a learning curve for everybody, including the SEC, and we'll just have to see how it goes.
Okay, I just thought I'd squeeze that one in because I'm sure that a number of teachers who probably would feel the same way or would want to ask that question.
Yeah.
So again, Peter, thanks so much for a great presentation there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Guy. Thanks everybody for coming along.
Yeah, and as I said, you know, there's more information about real-world geography if you'd like to check out our website or to get into contact with your local rep. But again, that's it. Thanks so much for joining us, and I wish you a very good evening. All the best.
Thanks, folks. See you again.